Mother-in-law attempted to claim my family's ranch, called the police on us, and ended up in jail after a bee attack. I live on a small ranch in a very rural area, land that's been in my family since my grandfather's time. We're about 15 minutes from the nearest town, and when I say small town, I mean truly small. It was 6 years ago when I first met my wife, completely by chance during a routine grocery run. She had this authentic tomboy energy about her and was completely new to the area. She just finished college and discovered she absolutely despised city life, wanting to return to something more genuine and familiar. I suppose she noticed me pulling up in my pickup with heavy equipment loaded in the back, because she walked right over and asked what kind of livestock I raised. She was refreshingly direct about it. She needed work, had solid experience with animals, and was brand new to the area. It's pretty unusual in our neck of the woods to have single women seeking ranch hand positions, but she was confident she could prove herself. She said if I wasn't impressed, I could simply drive her back to the bus stop in town and that would be the end of it. I'd been needing extra help for the busy season ahead and had been considering reaching out to my neighbor's sons, but I decided to give her a chance. Best decision I ever made. She possessed an incredible work ethic and was incredibly proactive about every aspect of ranch life. I offered her the guest room in the main house for her first week until she earned enough for her own apartment, but within 6 months she'd moved back in when we started dating. 8 months later, we held a small wedding ceremony with about 20 friends and family members in attendance. The only person from her side of the family who showed up was her uncle. This man was built like a tank, even in his advanced years, and owned a sheep farm up in Northern California. We talked shop quite a bit during his visit, and I could see the pride in his eyes when he gave my wife away. It was obvious where she'd inherited her work ethic and livestock knowledge from this remarkable man. However, there was one subject my wife absolutely refused to discuss: her birth parents. Initially, all she'd reveal was that there was bad blood between them. Early in our relationship, I respected that boundary. But after we got engaged, I wanted to understand more about her background and what I was truly getting myself into. Her mother, who I'll call the professor, taught at a college in some department I'd probably never encounter. Her father, Phil, was what my wife described as a weak man who does whatever the professor demands. Some of the stories my wife shared about the professor's behavior sounded absolutely absurd and borderline unhinged. This included attempting to set my wife up with a girlfriend in middle school, insisting she was a lesbian. Now, my wife is definitely a tomboy, there's no question about that, but she is absolutely not a lesbian. There was apparently a period when the professor decided she wanted to embrace a natural lifestyle, and she convinced Phil's brother to let them live on his farm. Within a single week, the professor despised farm life and dragged them both back to the city. My wife, on the other hand, felt like she'd finally discovered her true calling and formed a deep connection with her uncle. She left home at 16 and lived with her uncle until she turned 18. Throughout her time with her uncle, the professor constantly threatened to drag her back home, though she never followed through. After my wife turned 18, she attended college and earned a 4-year degree, then attempted to work in an office environment, but found it completely unfulfilling. She began taking buses to rural areas and working various odd jobs, searching for something that matched what she was looking for. That's when our paths crossed. Last March, we started receiving mail addressed to the professor and Phil, bills, bank statements, and similar correspondence. I found this extremely strange, and my wife wanted to simply throw it all away. I began marking everything returned to sender and no such occupant before dropping it right back into the mailbox. This situation came to a dramatic head in October when I was cleaning up the yard and noticed a bright white SUV approaching with a U-Haul trailer attached. My wife looked up and went completely pale. "Oh God, it's them," she whispered. Out stepped a rotund woman and a thin man who bore only a passing resemblance to her uncle. The professor immediately approached my wife with false enthusiasm. "Well, let me have a look at you. It's been years," she announced. "Mom, what are you doing here?" My wife responded cautiously. "The university is conducting virtual classes, and with COVID, we figured we could self-isolate at our ranch." The way she emphasized our sent chills down my spine. "Excuse me, but this isn't your ranch," I interjected. "Oh, I'm sure we can have the ownership all cleared up." "Well, aren't you going to invite us in?" she replied with disturbing confidence. "Ma'am, you may be my wife's mother, but you're a complete stranger to me. I'd rather not." The professor immediately turned to Phil with a commanding look. "Make the call." Phil instantly pulled out his phone and contacted the police, spinning an elaborate tale about how we were preventing them from entering the house they supposedly co-owned with us. I couldn't believe what I was hearing and how insanely the situation was being twisted. Fortunately, living in a small town has its advantages. The sheriff who responded was someone I'd known most of my life. He truly embodies the mindset of a small-town officer. He tries to be a peacemaker and peacekeeper above all else. He also knew perfectly well that this land had been in my family's name for 3 generations. "What's this I hear about you selling half your ranch, Duke?" he asked with obvious confusion. "I didn't. These are my wife's parents and they believe they have some legal claim to my property." "Not believe, no. We've been living here since February. With tenant laws, that means," the professor interrupted aggressively. "Funny, I don't remember seeing you around town," the sheriff replied, which immediately shut her up. She then reached into her bag and produced a stack of letters, many of them the bills and bank statements bearing the ranch's address. Then how do you explain these? She demanded. The sheriff examined the letters carefully. Ma'am, these are all marked return to sender. The professor's demeanor shifted to desperation. Please. I haven't seen my daughter in years. I just want to make sure she's okay. Surely you can see that he is controlling her every move, she said, pointing accusingly at me. The sheriff rolled his eyes and walked over to speak with my wife and me privately. Again, he genuinely likes to resolve conflicts between people, and he'd never encountered this level of insanity before. You might just want to invite them in for coffee. Talk for a few minutes. They are your parents, after all, he suggested to my wife. If you leave them here, you'll just have to return in 5 minutes to handle an assault, my wife responded firmly. You can't mean that. They're your family. Look, I'm just going to head up the road. Invite them in, talk to them. He continued. My wife got a dangerous glint in her eye. Does this mean you're going to invite your cousin Aaron to Thanksgiving? The sheriff's cousin Aaron was currently serving 8 years for multiple felonies, and the sheriff's entire family considered him the family's disgrace. With that statement, the look in the sheriff's eyes completely changed. He gave my wife a look that said, that bad, huh? And she simply nodded. The sheriff turned back to the professor and Phil with newfound resolve. All right, they don't want you here. I suggest you two don't come back. They protested briefly, but then climbed back into their SUV and drove off, with the sheriff following closely behind to ensure they completely left the property. This was my first encounter with the professor and Phil, and it definitely left a lasting impression. In December, the situation escalated to even more bizarre levels. I'd stopped in town for supplies, and by the time I finished loading my truck, the professor appeared and tapped me on the shoulder. This time she actually behaved cordially, though I chose to remain curt with her. She practically begged me to listen to her for just 5 minutes at the local cafe. I didn't want her creating a scene on Main Street, so I reluctantly agreed. We sat down and the professor launched into her spiel. She claimed my wife had always been confused about her identity, and that she and Phil only had her best interests at heart. I didn't want to yell, shout, or throw accusations back at her. I was simply counting down the minutes until this ordeal ended. Then she said my wife had seen me coming and manipulated her way into my life. That's when I finally pushed back. I told her that I felt blessed to have my wife in my life. Big mistake. Those were apparently the absolute wrong words to use with this woman. What do you mean blessed? She demanded. Pardon? I replied, confused. You just said blessed. She practically shouted. I put my head in my hands, wishing this nightmare would end, while everyone in the cafe stared at us. The professor had really projected her voice with that outburst. Ma'am, if you're trying to win me over, I suggest you stop using vinegar, I said. She huffed at that comment but did manage to become cordial again. She dug into her purse and produced a flash drive, placing it on the table between us. Fine. This contains all the proof you need. Take a look, and I promise you'll know the truth. I was dying inside from embarrassment over how my mother-in-law was behaving, with people I regularly do business with, watching the entire scene unfold. They'd want to know what happened and why. That's how small towns work. I took the flash drive and left immediately. When I returned to the ranch, my wife could instantly tell something had happened in town from the furious expression on my face. I explained the cafe incident and held up the flash drive. My wife looked puzzled by it. I certainly wasn't about to plug this thing into any computer we regularly used, so I dug through a closet for an old Dell laptop that hadn't been powered on in years. We let it charge, turned it on, and disabled the Wi-Fi. That was my wife's idea. When we plugged in the flash drive, we found stacks and stacks of PDF files. I'm still not sure how to describe what was contained in those files. It appeared to be some kind of journal, college paper, thesis, or study with my wife as the subject. I couldn't determine what the professor's purpose was or what she was attempting to test on her own flesh and blood. The documents detailed everything from my wife playing with toy dump trucks as a child to wearing overalls during the brief time they lived with her uncle. All of it was written in a cold, detached, clinical manner. My wife was referred to as the subject throughout the entire thing. It was absolutely bizarre, and I still can't figure out what the point of any of it was. My wife looked disgusted by the PDF files and insisted we burn the drive immediately, which we did in our fire pit. That was the last time we heard from the professor, though my wife suspected more was coming. I want to mention that my wife is doing fine. She's more amused than scared or angry, but I can tell when she feels the need to be guarded. We installed a new camera pointed directly at the gate and have been keeping it locked. I had a FaceTime call with my wife's uncle last night to see if we could gain more insight into the situation. Initially, her uncle gave very short responses, things like yeah, sounds like her and sounds about right. He's very much a don't speak ill of others type of person. When I told him about the bizarre attempt to claim ownership of the ranch, he finally became willing to share more information. Apparently, the professor had attempted something similar in the past with his sheep farm. He explained that the professor was a major reason why he and Phil no longer speak. My wife's uncle's sheep farm had been part of a much larger piece of land owned by my wife's grandfather. The grandfather had 3 children, 2 sons and a daughter. The daughter moved to the East Coast and works in some high-paying executive position. She's nearing retirement and was the oldest of the siblings. When the grandfather died, he divided his property into 3 sections. His daughter sold her portion to the uncle for almost nothing. She had no interest in rural property and knew the uncle wanted to keep the farm operational. The other son, my Phil, technically maintained ownership but gave the uncle permission to continue using the land. That arrangement lasted until Phil decided he wanted to attend an expensive university. He sold his portion of the land to the uncle for a substantial amount of money, allowing the uncle to keep all of grandfather's land in one piece. During college, Phil met and married the professor. The uncle heard bits and pieces about their life, but Phil only called during Thanksgiving and birthdays, and that was about the extent of their communication for many years. A few years later, the professor entered what the uncle called a hipster phase and became interested in the farm. She didn't just show up unannounced, Phil had asked first. Phil understood what rural life entailed, but the professor had no clue. The uncle described the professor as having a romanticized vision of waking up to a kale smoothie, digging up beets for lunch, and enjoying the sunshine for the rest of the day. If you've ever lived on a farm or ranch, you know there's no shortage of daily chores demanding attention. The uncle's farm was primarily focused on sheep, but they also maintained a vegetable garden and a small orchard, which meant constant work. The uncle went easy on the professor, assigning her only simple tasks like clipping dead vines in the garden and turning the compost. She apparently treated these basic chores like they were major ordeals. She nearly destroyed the tomatoes the uncle was growing that year, and he had to redo the compost every single evening. But the way she complained, you'd think she was managing the entire orchard and sheep operation single-handedly. She absolutely despised manual labor. However, she was also strangely infatuated with the idea of farm life. You can't experience the joy without accepting the hard work, in my experience. My wife, on the other hand, took to farm life like a duck to water. She loved checking fences, monitoring the flock, distributing feed, and tending to the small vegetable garden. The uncle mentioned they had a local butcher who visited periodically to purchase a few lambs, depending on pricing and demand. The butcher happened to visit once during the professor's stay on the farm. The butcher was a black man, which the uncle didn't mind or care about whatsoever. The professor, however, very much cared. She made an elaborate show of greeting him, shaking his hand, and speaking to him in a very condescending, sing-songy, high-pitched manner that the uncle found extremely strange enough to mention to us years later. The professor wanted to own the farm but had no interest in actually working it. She wanted legal ownership on paper while having the uncle and her husband handle all the actual labor. She even pushed her husband to contest the sale he'd made to the uncle years earlier to gain partial ownership. This attempt went absolutely nowhere, of course. The uncle did have to hire a lawyer, but the case didn't even make it to court. He and the rest of the family refused to speak to Phil after that incident. I was curious about why the professor had exploded at me when I said I was blessed to have my wife. The uncle chuckled at this. "Really kicked that hornet's nest, huh?" he said. On the professor's first night staying with the uncle, he and his wife had prepared dinner. When they sat down at the table, the uncle was about to say grace. My wife blushed when he brought this up. Apparently this is a very embarrassing memory for her. The professor completely lost it. She said something about how this family doesn't say grace. The uncle shrugged, wanting to be accommodating, and responded that she didn't have to participate if she didn't want to. She tried to escalate the situation further. As long as she was in that house, there would be no saying grace. The uncle said this was the first time he'd been rude to the professor. He told her there was absolutely no way a guest was going to dictate what he could and couldn't do in his own home. Apparently, the professor didn't think people in rural areas attended church or something. After hearing about the sheep farm situation, I decided to get in touch with a lawyer to see how that would go. Living in a small town means my crazy mother-in-law, the professor, has created quite a stir with just 2 appearances, one at our residence and another in town. What I love about small towns is that everyone feels like family and watches out for each other. What I hate is how quickly rumors spread. The sheriff is completely on our side and has done his best to make it clear to anyone who asks that it's none of their business. The problem is that my wife and I genuinely enjoy being social in town. Before COVID, we attended church regularly and participated in community potlucks. I've hired my neighbor's sons multiple times during summer months to help around the ranch. We love being part of the community. When the professor created that scene at the cafe in December, I could feel the entire town's eyes on me. Nobody knows exactly what happened, but they desperately want to. I can sense it. They're too polite to ask directly, but not polite enough to avoid whispering among themselves. It's really getting to us. The sheriff told me that last week the local pastor directly asked him what was happening with my wife and her mother. The sheriff said the pastor felt there should be an easy solution to the situation. The sheriff immediately shut that down. My wife's words about her cousin Aaron had a stronger impact than we'd realized. The sheriff told the pastor it wasn't his business or anyone else's unless we specifically asked for help. He did tell the pastor, and I'm remembering exactly how the sheriff phrased it when he told me, "They're part of your flock. She's the wolf. Be a good shepherd." Even with that support, I still feel the uncomfortable stares every time I'm in town. Scenes like the one in December simply don't happen around here. Well, it finally happened. The professor and Phil are sitting in jail. The circumstances are somewhat bizarre, but we're relieved there's finally some resolution. 2 nights ago, the sheriff called us in the middle of the day. My wife answered, and after a few minutes of conversation, she started laughing. She told me what the sheriff had shared with her. It seems the professor and Phil had decided they wanted to attempt sneaking onto our property. Why? I honestly can't predict this woman's thinking anymore. The professor apparently decided that instead of trying to access the ranch from the farm road, which we have a clear view of from the house, she and Phil would park some distance away and try to reach our land by cutting through a neighbor's property. My neighbor to the east maintains a small orchard and is a hobby beekeeper. He doesn't harvest much honey annually, but what he does produce he either shares with neighbors or sells at the farmer's market. The field chickweed had just started blooming, so the bees were particularly active. The professor apparently stumbled directly into his bee boxes, and I mean literally bumped into one. The bees immediately started swarming her, and either she or Phil got angry and actually kicked one of the boxes over. My neighbor keeps motion sensors around his bee boxes as protection against bears, so the alarm went off and he ran to investigate. He found 2 middle-aged people running around frantically, swatting at bees and screaming. My neighbor immediately called the sheriff, and after about 20 minutes of the neighbor trying to smoke the bees and hose them off the intruders, he promptly pressed charges for destruction of property and trespassing. Apparently, there are additional charges for disrupting and destroying a farm's agricultural operations, and since his bees serve as pollinators for his orchard, off to jail they went. Both were reportedly covered in bee stings and are currently in county lockup. The sheriff said the professor is trying to claim the area where the bee boxes are located was a public easement and that she had legal access to the area, but for now, it's finally over. Everyone here is breathing a huge sigh of relief. Update 1. It's been 3 weeks since my last update, and unfortunately, the drama with my wife's parents is far from over. In fact, it's taken a turn I never could have predicted. The professor and Phil spent 4 days in county lockup before making bail. The charges stuck: criminal trespassing, destruction of property, and disrupting agricultural operations. My neighbor was pretty satisfied with how things played out, especially since his insurance covered the damaged bee boxes and he got to tell the story at the farmer's market for weeks. I thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong. Last Tuesday, my wife was in the garden when she suddenly went completely still. I looked up from fixing a fence post and saw her staring at the driveway. A woman in a business suit was walking up toward the house, briefcase in hand. My first thought was that it was some kind of insurance adjuster or maybe someone from the county about permits. "Are you Mrs. Sarah Mitchell?" the woman asked my wife. My wife nodded, and the woman handed her an envelope. "You're being served." My blood ran cold. The professor was suing us for grandparents' rights and unlawful separation from family. But here's the kicker: my wife doesn't have any children. We've been trying for about a year now, but no luck yet. That evening, my wife was unusually quiet over dinner. She kept picking at her food and staring out the window. Finally, she looked at me with this expression I'd never seen before. "There's something I never told you about why I left home at 16, she said quietly. I put down my fork. "What do you mean?" "I was pregnant." The words hit me like a truck. My wife started crying, and through the tears, she told me the whole story. She'd gotten pregnant by her high school boyfriend when she was 15. The professor had been furious, not because her daughter was pregnant, but because she hadn't been consulted about the boy my wife was dating. The professor had demanded my wife give the baby up for adoption, but only to a family the professor personally approved of. My wife refused. She wanted to keep the baby, but the professor threatened to have her declared mentally incompetent and take custody herself. I ran away to my uncle's place the day I turned 16, my wife continued. I had the baby there, a little girl. My uncle helped me place her with a family he knew, good people who couldn't have children of their own. I was trying to process all of this. Where is she now? I don't know. The adoption was closed, and my uncle promised he'd never tell me who the family was unless she came looking for me first. He said it was better that way. The next morning, I called the lawyer my uncle had recommended. After reading through the legal papers, he started chuckling. This is one of the most ridiculous filings I've ever seen. You can't claim grandparents' rights to a child that doesn't exist in your custody. But then he got serious. However, if there is a child out there, and if your wife's parents can prove they're the grandparents, this could get complicated. That's when it hit me. The professor somehow knew about my wife's daughter. All those clinical notes on the flash drive, all that documentation, she'd been building a case file. 2 days later, the sheriff called again. This time, he wasn't laughing. "Duke, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be straight with me. Does your wife have a child?" I felt like the ground was falling out from under me. "Why are you asking?" "Because a 17-year-old girl showed up at the station this morning asking about her. She's got your wife's eyes and her uncle's build. And she's got a birth certificate with your wife's name on it. My wife was in the barn when I found her. I told her what the sheriff had said, and she just sat down heavily on a hay bale. I always wondered if this day would come," she whispered. The girl, Emma, had been raised by the family my wife's uncle had chosen. Good people, apparently. The adoptive father had passed away 2 years ago, and the mother had recently remarried. Emma didn't get along with her stepfather and had started asking questions about her birth parents. She'd tracked down my wife's uncle first, and he'd given her our general location but made her promise to go through proper channels. The problem was, Emma had also reached out to the professor somehow, probably through social media or public records. Now the professor was claiming that Emma was being corrupted by living with us, even though Emma had never even met us, and that she had rights as a biological grandmother to protect her granddaughter. The sheriff arranged for us to meet Emma at the station. Walking into that room and seeing my wife's face on a 17-year-old girl was surreal. Emma was nervous but polite, and she had questions, lots of them. "I don't want to cause trouble," she said. "I just wanted to know where I came from." My wife was crying again, but this time they were different tears. "You're not causing trouble, sweetheart. You're not causing any trouble at all. Emma has been staying with us for the past week while her adoptive mother flies out to meet us and figure out what's best for everyone. She's a sweet kid, loves the ranch, helps with chores without being asked, and has her mother's work ethic. But the professor isn't done. She's filed for emergency custody of Emma, claiming that my wife is unfit and that Emma is in danger. The court date is next month. Emma, for her part, thinks her biological grandmother is completely nuts. Her words, not mine. I grew up hearing stories about my birth mom's family, Emma told us yesterday. My adoptive mom always said my birth mom came from good people, but that her parents were difficult. The whole town is talking now. It's impossible to keep something like this quiet in a place this small. But the reaction has been interesting. People are protective of my wife and suspicious of the professor. The pastor even stopped by yesterday to check on us. "I hear you've got family visiting," he said with a knowing smile. "That's wonderful news. I'm not sure what's going to happen next. The lawyer thinks the professor's case is weak, but family court can be unpredictable. Emma wants to stay with us, at least for the summer, but her adoptive mother is understandably concerned about the legal drama. My wife is happier than I've seen her in months, despite everything. She keeps saying she can't believe Emma turned out so well, and that she's proud of the woman who raised her. I made the right choice, she told me last night. I just never thought I'd get to see the result. The professor hasn't tried to contact Emma directly yet, but I'm sure that's coming. For now, we're taking things one day at a time and enjoying getting to know the daughter my wife thought she'd never see again. Though I have to admit, watching my wife teach Emma how to properly mend a fence while Emma talks about her college plans has been one of the best things I've ever witnessed." Update 2. It's been 2 months since Emma came into our lives, and I honestly thought things were finally settling down. The court hearing went better than expected. The judge took one look at the professor's evidence and basically laughed her out of the courtroom. Emma's adoptive mother, Linda, flew out and stayed with us for a week. She's a remarkable woman who clearly raised Emma with love and patience. After seeing how happy Emma was here and how well she got along with my wife, Linda agreed to let Emma spend the summer with us before starting her senior year back home. The professor was ordered to stay away from Emma and from our property. I genuinely believe that was the end of it. I should have known better. 3 weeks ago, I was in town picking up feed when I ran into Jake Morrison, one of the neighbor kids I'd hired during previous summers. Jake's about 19 now, good looking in that small town way, and he's been helping Emma learn to ride our horses. I'd noticed them spending a lot of time together, but I figured it was just friendship. Emma's only 17, after all. "Hey, Duke," Jake said, looking uncomfortable. "I need to tell you something about Emma." My stomach dropped. "What about her?" "She's been asking me to drive her to town in the evenings. Says she's just getting ice cream or meeting friends, but..." He looked around nervously. "I saw her getting into a car with some older guy yesterday. Looked like he was from the city." I felt that familiar cold dread. What did he look like? Thin, maybe 40? Drove a rental car. Emma seemed to know him pretty well. I thanked Jake and headed home immediately. Emma was in the barn with my wife, both of them laughing about something. She looked so innocent, so happy. I didn't want to accuse her of anything, but I had to ask. "Emma, honey, have you been meeting anyone in town we should know about?" The laughter died instantly. Emma's face went pale, and she looked at my wife with panic in her eyes. "What do you mean?" My wife asked, but I could see she was already putting pieces together. "Jake saw her getting into a car with a man yesterday, an older man." Emma started crying. "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. I didn't know what to do." My wife put her arms around Emma. "What's going on, sweetheart?" "He said he was my grandfather. My real grandfather. He said my biological father's parents had been looking for me for years, and that they wanted to meet me." My blood ran cold. "Emma, what did you tell him?" "Everything. About you guys, about living here, about the court case. He seemed so nice, and he had pictures of my dad when he was young. He looked just like me." I exchanged a look with my wife. We both knew this couldn't be good. "Where did you meet him?" My wife asked gently. "At the ice cream place. He said he'd been trying to find me since I was born, but that some woman had been blocking him. He said she was dangerous and that I needed to be careful." The professor. It had to be connected to the professor somehow. That evening, after Emma went to bed, my wife and I sat on the porch trying to figure out what was happening. My wife was quiet for a long time before she spoke. "I never told you who Emma's father was," she said quietly. "You don't have to if you don't want to. His name was David. David Chen." He was a senior when I was a sophomore. Really smart, planning to go to college on a scholarship. She paused. His parents were traditional. Very traditional. When they found out I was pregnant, they wanted nothing to do with me or the baby. They said I was trying to trap their son and ruin his future. What happened to him? He went to college, last I heard. We lost touch after Emma was born. I always assumed he moved on with his life. The next morning, I called the sheriff. He agreed to meet us at the station to talk about the situation. When we arrived, he had a file folder on his desk. I did some checking after you called, he said. There's no record of anyone named Chen inquiring about Emma through official channels. But I did find something interesting. He opened the folder and pulled out a printout. David Chen died in a car accident 3 years ago. He was living in Seattle, working as an engineer. Never married, no children listed in his records. My wife went white. Then who was Emma talking to? That's what we need to find out. The sheriff had Emma come in to give a description of the man she'd met. As she talked, I watched the sheriff's expression grow more serious. Emma, did this man give you his name? He said to call him Grandpa Chen. But his first name was Michael. The sheriff wrote something down. Did he ask you to keep your meetings secret? Emma nodded, looking ashamed. He said if certain people found out, they might try to stop us from getting to know each other. After Emma left the room, the sheriff turned to us. I think you need to be very careful. This has all the hallmarks of someone trying to manipulate a minor. And the timing, right after your court case. You think the professor is involved? I asked. I think someone is using Emma to get to you. And I think they're escalating. That night, my wife couldn't sleep. She kept getting up to check on Emma, making sure she was still in her room. Around 2 a.m., she shook me awake. Duke, there's a car in our driveway. I grabbed my rifle and looked out the window. Sure enough, there was a sedan parked near our gate with the headlights off. I called the sheriff while my wife went to check on Emma. She's not here, my wife said, panic in her voice. Her bed's empty. I ran outside, but the car was already pulling away. By the time the sheriff arrived, there was no sign of Emma anywhere. We searched the property for hours. The sheriff called in additional help, and by morning, we had volunteers from town combing the area. My wife was beside herself, blaming herself for not watching Emma more carefully. At noon, my phone rang. Unknown number. Hello? Duke, this is Emma. I'm okay, but I need you to listen carefully. Emma, where are you? Are you hurt? I'm fine, but I can't come home right now. The man I thought was my grandfather. He's not who he said he was. And there's something else. Something about my mom that I think you need to know. What are you talking about? I can't say too much over the phone. But Duke? My real father didn't die in a car accident. He's alive. And he's been looking for me too. But this other man, the one who took me. He's working with my grandmother. The professor. The line went dead. I immediately called the sheriff and told him what Emma had said. He was quiet for a long moment. Duke, I think you and your wife need to prepare for the possibility that this is bigger than we thought. If Emma's biological father is alive and involved, if the professor is orchestrating something this elaborate. What are you saying? I'm saying this might not be about grandparents' rights anymore. This might be about something else entirely. Something we haven't figured out yet. My wife was standing in the doorway, having heard the whole conversation. The look on her face was something I'd never seen before, not fear, not anger, but something deeper, something that told me there were still things about her past that I didn't understand. We need to talk, she said quietly. There are things about David, about Emma's father, that I never told you. Things that might explain why someone would go to all this trouble. As I write this, Emma's been missing for 18 hours. The FBI has been called in because we're dealing with what they're calling a potential kidnapping across state lines. My wife has been talking to them for the past 3 hours, and from what I can hear through the closed door, the story is far more complicated than I ever imagined. I thought I knew everything about my wife's past. I was wrong. And now Emma's life might depend on secrets that have been buried for almost 18 years.